Hey, everyone. And a reminder to the folks over at the side just to keep your voices down so everyone can hear. This is a fun conversation, especially for me. I never get to interview fellow journalists, ever. And so this is really special. I'm here with some of the best in the business, reporters, hosts, correspondents who cover the business of sports and who cover sports. So let me introduce everyone. To my right, Tina Cervasio, Fox 5, New York's lead sports anchor and a CBS Sports Network sideline host, where she sometimes bumps into Aaron West all the way at the end of the panel, who is an analyst at CBS Sports, covering all things soccer for a very long time. Seated next to Aaron is Vinciane, the reporter and digital creator for The Boardroom. If you guys don't know, Rich Klein's big business. Seated next to her is Ndeye. She's a founder of 1931, and she does a ton of coverage of sports in Africa. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. And then last but not least, we have Mollie. Mollie comes from Sports Business Journal. She is the new senior media reporter there, previously at Adweek. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
This is very fun because as a journalist interviewing other journalists, I feel like I have more notes to take than ever before on what all of your tips and tricks are. But Tina, let's start with you. In covering women's sports, what do you think is the key thing to notice or pay attention to as a journalist that you might not have focused on as much in covering men's sports?
Well, first of all, to get that story on the women's team or the league or the player on the air, that was a challenge earlier in my career, specifically in local news, because we have such a limited amount of time to even cover sports. And in New York, we have 14 professional teams. And it always bothers me when I run into a lot of other broadcasters and New York reporters, and they talk about the 11 professional teams, and I go off. Because there's a basketball team and a soccer team and a hockey team that you're forgetting in your little list of all your sports. So that's been the challenge specifically in the New York market. But for me, it's all about storytelling. And I think I want to get the personality, the human, so that it connects with my audience. So then it might take someone who wasn't watching Gotham FC that, wow, I got to watch that game because that woman did this, or she came from that, or she overcame this, or my daughter is going through that at the high school level or whatnot. And it just draws people to the sport. And I think that's been the topic all day. Where do we go? What's going to connect us? We've got to get these stories out, and that's going to grow the market. It's going to grow the ticket sales and the merchandise sales. So for me, I want to bring the personal level, where they've come from, their stories, to our audience, and it's about the connection, and to make them feel like she's one of our own. But then also it's the greatness. We have to bring that to the forefront, because there is some greatness. And again, I'm speaking specifically for New York, and we're so blessed to have the Liberty and Gotham and the PWHL team now. And there is such greatness, and it's the same level that we see with all those other teams that I have to cover as well. So for me, and it's also just an honor sometimes to bring those stories of these women, whether they're Olympians or the international stories I love to bring, especially from the soccer team. And, but it's been a challenge, but it has been changing. And I really, whether it was the Women's World Cup, because it was on Fox Sports, so we did a lot of ancillary programming around the Women's World Cup, both in 15 and 19, and 2 summers ago. And now we have a partnership with the New York Liberty. They're going to be on our air on Fox 5 and our sister station, My 9. And what do? We create more content to drive people to our broadcasts. So that's something that I'm so excited to start bringing. It starts on May 4th with their Media Day.
May 4th, everyone mark it on your calendar. So then a follow-up for you on that. If you are somebody that needs to advocate to your station managers, to your program directors, to your producers, to air more women's sports, what is the tactic that you go about in doing that?
just kind of bringing the story to the forefront. I mean, this, I'm just trying to think of an example. I did a lot of World Cup stories last year on 6 players that went to 5 different nations from Gotham FC. It wasn't just the players on the U.S. women's national team. And their backstories, maybe Ireland has a national team in the World Cup for the first time, whatever that story may be. We saw Nigeria, go through and further than they expected, things like that. I mean, I think it's just the personality, and then and then you remind all those, girl dads out there, like you're speaking to your audience. People have daughters, and that, we would want to present them with this sport. Yes, you can play professional hockey in the New York area. And maybe they didn't know that initially if they live in a certain town and whatnot. So it's just about the broader scope of bringing that into those homes and to those families, and it just creates viewership and it creates the interest. Let's go buy tickets. Let's go to a game. Let's buy a hat. Let's buy a jersey.
It's a flywheel of interest. Ndeye, what's interesting about Tina's experience is that it reminded me of yours, and that you are starting something called #AfricaSports, where you're advocating for the coverage of women's sports in Africa. You have to go against the grain and push for it. How are you doing that, and what does success look like?
First of all, I'm happy to be here to represent African voices and the African continent. Contrary to a former president's image of the continent, we have a lot of beautiful stories to say. We had Barbara Benda on stage earlier, and I think she represents the type of opportunities that we're trying to create with #AfricaScores. We have more and more African players joining U.S. leagues, so whether NWSL, WNBA, and what we're attempting to do is making sure that we get to connect the dots between those African women talents and the economic opportunity of sports on the African continent. Right now, we're at the end of April. We were supposed to have the Women's African Cup of Nations happen this year, and we still don't have a date for that tournament, which is the biggest tournament for soccer in Africa. And my argument is that if we had the proper connection and engagement with the fans of African women's soccer, then we would already have the dates for that tournament. We would already have all the sponsors for that tournament. So that's where, with #AfricaScores, we're coming into the fold and attempting to cover the business of sports in Africa, obviously women's sports, but all African sports, really, just to say, hey guys, there is an opportunity for sports in Africa, both for African players to go and play in the US or internationally, or also to build leagues on the continents. That's what we're doing.
In terms of coverage, how are most people accessing coverage of women's sports? Is it through television? Is it through digital? Is it through social media?
I'm glad you asked that question. I've told that story to a few people already, but I had to watch the NCAA finals on FaceTime. I called my dad. My dad lives in the US, and I called him. I'm like, listen, just call me on FaceTime. I need to watch the game. And luckily, I'm glad to announce that we just learned that ESPN Africa acquired the rights for the NWSL. So, yes. Woo. It's finally coming. We have more and more of these deals. But I think, when it comes to the WNBA, I was telling Alicia, same problem. It's, we have to have more media coverage. For now, I feel like women's sports doesn't get the coverage that it deserves. With #AfricaScores, we have a business angle, but there's definitely a need, I think, for more streaming partners or broadcast partners to come into the fold and cover women's sports in Africa, knowing that what we have on the continent is a language barrier where you have a lot of Anglophones, but also a lot of Francophones, some Lusophones, some Arabophones. So you have to make sure that every single pocket of language is being covered. So while ESPN Africa covering the NWSL is a good thing, most Francophone Africans, like West Africa, Central Africa, will not get to have access to that channel because they don't broadcast there because of the language barrier. So we still have a lot of work to do, but, it's a start.
And in the interim, until you can get some of the video partnerships through, you think digital is the primary way?
I honestly think so, especially when you look at the penetration of digital and mobile penetration in Africa. It would be much easier if we had a YouTube, and I don't know if there's anybody from Google in the room, but I hope you hear my message. But if we had a partner like YouTube coming in, and YouTube is already covering a couple of games, especially for basketball. Like a lot of FIBA games are broadcasted directly on YouTube, and I feel like that's something we have to continue pushing for because it makes it much more accessible for people to watch it on their mobile device. And I mean, I watched a game on FaceTime, so I can watch it on YouTube too. Like it's a possibility. So yeah.
Watching a game on FaceTime is a whole other level of commitment.
It was this or illegal streaming, and I couldn't even find a legal streaming link. So I'm technically legal-ish kind of thing. Yeah.
We won't rat you out. It's our secret here.
Yeah.
Vinciane, what is Boardroom? Yeah. I think I know what it is. I think some people in the audience know, but can you explain what it is? And then what does your job as a reporter for Boardroom look like covering women's sports?
Yeah, so Boardroom, we were founded in 2019, and we are co-owned by Kevin Durant and his agent, Rich Kleiman. And I like to think of it as sports, everything except for the score. So we cover how money moves through sports, whether it be through player endorsements or contract signed. And in my case, I speak a lot about with athletes on sort of their interests and how they leverage their influence outside of the court, the pitch, whatever you may call it. And I think I really found my niche at Boardroom because not only am I able to do through reporting long form pieces, but also on the digital side, a lot of on-camera work. And we've been able to, all the writers, been able to leverage that into their own vertical, which is what I do, my daily newsletter, Headline to Go. And so I really do enjoy just the idea that when it comes to women, they are just more than athletes, and we're able to really profile them. And of course, through our work with Gotham and Athletes Unlimited, and Kevin and Rich also do work with volleyball, I think we've really been able to really see how much fun it is when you not only put the athlete on the pitch or on the court, but also talk about what moves them and what motivates them from my financial aspect off of that.
What do you find motivates female athletes when you speak to them?
I think for me, what I've always recognized is that they truly love being representative of their culture, of their hometowns, of their team, all aspects of it. And I mean, we have two African women sitting on stage, and I think that as someone that never really saw African representation growing up playing soccer, but also as a reporter, I think they really see the connection that we make, and that's what I try to do in all the athletes, and even all the execs and any agents that I speak with, is making that connection so they do see some sort of representation. And I always say that if anyone reads Headline to Go, or they read any of my stories and they feel very moved by it, even if it's one person, that I feel like I've done my job.
Let's pivot a little bit away from some of the emotional aspect to the hard business aspect that Mollie covers. Mollie just got a new incredible role as the senior media reporter at Sports Business Journal. And your experience covering the media business, covering advertising, covering marketing, is going to parlay very nicely into this role. How are you planning to cover the business of women's sports? And what are the major trends that you're looking at?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to be here, first of all. So 3 weeks into my new job, I'll answer as best as I can. But I've been covering advertising and television and media for years at this point. So I think what's important to note is that I am the media reporter, and that's all sports, because apparently men play sports too. Sources tell me that, not confirmed. But I think what I'm really excited about is SBJ is such a legacy publication, and I'm very excited to join it. But I'm also excited to bring a fresh angle to it and make women's sports more of a priority. Not that they haven't been, but I'm someone that's coming in really hard and advocating for this, because I don't need to tell this crowd this, but I mean, women's sports are not having a moment, it's been here. Everyone else is just now finally paying attention. And having such a big platform, I'm able to help other people who might not have seen that yet. I mean, I'm not gonna give the numbers for NCAA March Madness, we all know them, but it's happening across all sports. Like, you've got gymnastics on ABC, you've got, like, women's college softball outperforms baseball constantly. So I think on the business side of it, it's really important, and I know there's a lot of brands and agencies in here, and you guys know that, that's why you're here. But having the platform of being able to express how women's sports is just good business and having such wide viewership, I think is gonna be very pivotal.
That's incredible. And then thinking about your experience when you covered more on the ad side and brands, what types of brands do you see often showing up to support women's sports versus the ones who are sitting in the sidelines?
This is one of my favorite questions because I get to shout out some amazing people. But I mean, we all are familiar with Ally Financial and Andrea Brimmer, their 50-50 pledge. Ally is showing up and other brands are paying attention. Like, I like to tell the story about Aflac and their CMO Garth Knutson. 2 years ago, there was an NCAA game in Vegas. It took 45 minutes for medical to get to an injured Auburn freshman. He saw that, and he instantly paused all of his spend on the men's tournament and moved it to the women's. And Aflac is a presenting partner. You're seeing that with Aflac, with Ally, with Dove, State Farm. I mean, we've all seen the Caitlin Clark commercials, but it's more than just Caitlin Clark. State Farm is showing up in big ways too. And then smaller brands, like Beauty is really getting into women's basketball specifically, but I mean, I'm just gonna say it, like the viewership for the women's tournament this year was 4 million more than the men, and a 30-second ad in the women's tournament cost $500,000 in the Final Four. For men, it was 2.2 million, and you're getting 4 million more viewers for a quarter of the price. It's just smart business.
That is unbelievable economics, 50,000 versus 2.2 million.
500,000.
What'd you say?
500,000.
Oh, 500,000. Still unbelievable economics. It's four times. Erin, you are a soccer guru. You've been covering soccer. You played soccer your entire life. Now covering soccer as an analyst at CBS Sports. You're covering both women's and men's. We have a breakthrough year ahead of us, right? We've got the Olympics coming up. How are you approaching your coverage in trying to make it as equitable as possible on air?
Well, first of all, I feel very honored to be a part of this panel. Thank you so much for having me. And second, if you see me yawn, it's because I have a 2-year-old son who likes to sprint out of his room in the middle of the night, so it's not anything going on here. I feel very blessed to be part of CBS's coverage. I've been covering soccer in a professional capacity since 2016 now, and since I've started covering soccer, since I've started following this sport, I've cared about both men's and women's soccer equally. I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. For me, that's the home of women's soccer. I love a winner. I love UNC. So I grew up going to Finley Fields and watching the women train, watching the men train. So I've always had an equal respect for both the men's and women's side of the game. My wife played for decades. She was a women's national team player. She is now that, thank you. My wife, I'm accepting that from my wife. She is the GM of Gotham FC, and women's soccer has always just kind of been part of who I am. My dad is the one who instilled that in me. He was the first black head coach in the ACC at UNC, but he was a track and field head coach. But I wanted to play soccer, and so everything he could do, he brought me to the fields. He brought me to games. He loves UNC women's soccer probably more than anyone. So because of that base, I've always just covered it because it's naturally how I wanted to cover the game. I've always tweeted about women's soccer and men's soccer equally. I had the incredible blessing to be able to work the Women's World Cup in France to host a live show in 2019 every night covering the World Cup holistically. Since then, I didn't really have an outlet to really fully cover it until we now had the Golasso channel on CBS. We have a 24-hour channel that just celebrated our 1-year anniversary a few days ago, a week or so ago. And with that, I get to sit on the desk and talk about women's soccer fully, the way that I would talk about men's soccer, the way I do talk about men's soccer. So for me, it's just the next step of a gradual progression of my natural journey. And now I have the space to really stretch out and speak about the game the way that I wanted to the whole time.
So interesting, the concept of carving out the space to have the conversation, because there have been such contraction in the TV space right now. I mean, there's a lot of addition in streaming channels, but NBC Sports, for example, shuttered its network. When you talked to CBS about building out this network, did you have explicit conversations about it being a home for more women's sports, or was that just something that happened to be a happy byproduct?
So I don't really make those decisions, I will say that. But the people that do make those decisions, and in conversation with them, they wanted to make this the home of soccer, of football. And that means all football, all soccer, women's soccer, men's soccer. And especially we sit in the United States of America right now, and we have a stronger women's soccer tradition here. And that it has to be said, and it has to be covered in that way, I think. So for me, it's, again, a natural progression. I think the network feels the same way I do. We have launched the first fully women's soccer show on the network called Attacking Third. I've been honored to sit on that desk with them. But the coverage is I like to call it holistic because it's all angles. I think the biggest progression for me is that I get to critique the game. I get to critique it in a way that I critique the men's game. Before, there wasn't that much space to talk about it, so it was all positives. But now, I get to critique the negatives. I get to talk tactically. I get to talk stories, everything holistically.
Dave, when we hear Erin talk about having the opportunity and the space for this coverage, that's what you're doing. Like, you're creating a space.
That's what we want to create, yeah.
That's what you want to create, right? You're creating the space for people to have the coverage. How are you recruiting others to get on board? Is there a pipeline of talent, of journalists? Are you training these people? How are you figuring that out?
So I'm glad you asked that question. So my company, 1931, has the media component called #AfricaScores, and next to that, we're working with a startup in East Africa, trying to develop a talent cloud platform to train people in different key jobs for the sports industry. So that includes journalism. So that's something that we're hoping to launch into next year. And other than that, there are other initiatives that already exist to increase the amount of journalists that can cover sports in Africa. And I'm going to give the example of the Basketball Africa League, which is the NBA's league in Africa. They've just recently launched this year their own workshops to have more journalists coming from different pockets of the continent to cover basketball with the different angles and the different stories. So it's coming up as well, and we have to continue building a pipeline of not just young people, but of reporters that can cover. But I'm saying young people specifically because, by 2030, Africa is going to have 42% of the global youth. I don't know if you realize from a number perspective what that represents. So we have to be able to use sports as a way to create those jobs. And young people are obviously interested in sports, so it's a perfect pathway, I think, for them. Yeah.
Tina, the broadcast industry has changed so dramatically. We were just talking backstage. It used to be that a great pipeline for local sports coverage was the regional sports networks, the cable networks. That business model has fallen out. It's put a lot of pressure now on the broadcast networks to pick up those rights and to start to create jobs. But it's tough out there. What's your advice to young women who want to cover sports, who want to cover women's sports? How do they get into the field and become someone like you?
Well, I think Aaron is a great example because of Golazo. It started digitally and tacking third. I saw it for the first time on Instagram, and then I started following them, and they create all of those programs from there. So I think digitally, you have to take and that's what the youth knows right now. And I always I go to high school classes and college classes, you could do more on your phone than we probably are doing in my studios on a local TV station in New York City. If you set up if you have enough ring lights and enough phones going at once. They can create their own show, and you can put anything you want on YouTube and create an entire channel. So then that's the pipeline, because then you're seen. And that's the whole purpose of it, and the hashtag, and what goes viral. And I have seen some young women out in the stands, like at Yankee Stadium, doing little shows and interviewing fans, and they've made their ways into getting credentials every so often to then, whether it's interviewing players themselves or actually interviewing other media, because I've been interviewed by them. So I tell them, get in the digital space, because you could do it by yourself. Nobody has to hire you. Take that initiative. And then you could also show your expertise. Do you play soccer? Are you a hockey player? You play basketball? Maybe you want to focus on that sport that you play. Advocate for someone. Is there a storyline? So they could do so much. You don't need, you could start at 15 years old. You don't have to be a graduate with your degree yet. We want you to still get your education, of course, yes, but to get ahead. And that's where that pipeline is, and that's where people are showing up, and that opportunities are there. So I'm excited for that youth. So yes, the whole television landscape is changing because of streaming and digital, but we're just trying to change with the times, those of us that have been in TV for a long time, but I think it's great for the youth, and so we're not in trouble, so to speak.
Yeah. Vinciane, what types of mediums do you find are working right now that aren't TV? Is it mostly relying on social? Is it TikTok? Where are people getting coverage of women's sports?
That's such a great question. I think for the most part, people are still craving the live broadcast coverage, and that's why I think it's so important through media rights deals that we have with the NWSL and the W, and of course across other leagues, that people still want that live feeling so they can really live in the moment. And I always say, being someone that consumes social media, it's fun to feel like you're with a family and talking about it at once. But so that's all to say, yeah, you go online. I do think TikTok, it does have a little bit of an upper advantage, but of course, now that you've seen Meta and they are actively also trying to integrate themselves within the women's sports game, I think it's just also a means of creating it your own. I mean, like we said, you can pick up a camera and all of a sudden you're a content creator. And so I love that I get to do that through my work, and now that we've been able to be recognized for it and everyone else on this stage, and most recently Headline to Go was nominated for a Shorty Award. So I think that's really
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. But I think that just allows us to really see that there is a lot of progress happening.
And quickly, because we have just a minute, Mollie, sometimes I look at like the Olympics, and the athletes, the female athletes, are doing such a good job of posting their own content. I think to myself, I can't even cover you better than you can cover you. So how are you looking at the rise of athletes as their own storytellers versus what you and I do and everyone on the stage does, which is telling their stories for them?
Yeah, I think that's so important, and it's like, there are definitely stats that prove it, but female athletes are just better at branding themselves than male athletes are, and that's why you see some of the highest NIL performers are women, because people crave storytelling and authenticity, and a lot of female athletes are doing that through Instagram, TikTok, social media. Like, look at Paige Becker's TikTok. Like, she gets like 2 million likes on stuff. So I think that's really important, and it helps fans feel a connection to the athlete, which in turn makes them feel more invested in the team and the storytelling and more likely to follow. So does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. And Aaron, we'll end on you. So you were saying your wife is involved in the sport too. What's the one thing you've learned from her about how women's sports are covered that you keep in mind when you're doing your coverage?
I've learned a lot from her. But I think for years, the women's league struggled to get a foothold. I think for the first time, NWSL feels secure. And part of that was coverage. Even now, it's very difficult to find the game sometimes, but 5 years ago, it was nigh impossible. Even before that, it just wasn't on TV. So coverage has always been a big thing for me. It's part of why I got into this. It just kind of naturally I kept talking about it, so I just keep talking about it. So I think speaking about the sport brings it more into fruition, and I think that we are now seeing an audience that knows and cares way more. The audience was always there, and now they actually get to see what they wanted to see. So I think probably just coverage is the biggest thing I've learned. I've seen my wife toil for countless hours, and now you're starting to see some of that fruition.
Definitely a theme of an underserved audience for a very long time. Mollie, what you had said before about a 30-second ad for the Women's NCAA Championship, which got 4 million more viewers, was 4 times less than a 30-second spot for the men, which is absolutely wild. You called out a few brands that have done a good job. Allies 50-50 Challenge, Inspiring Affleck, State Farm. Beauty is getting more into sponsoring sports. Ndeye, what you're doing and building your own thing in Africa to cover women's sports is absolutely unbelievable and commendable and not easy. And we hear your call loud and clear for a tech platform or a broadcast company.
Do not let me FaceTime the next year.
Yes, no
Guys,
FaceTiming.
I'm serious.
Live sports. And then sort of just to put a cap on everything, when you said by 2030, 42% of the world's youth is going to be in Africa, it reminds me of the fact that in 2024, the vast majority of women that work in boardrooms, or people that work in boardrooms, are women. Like, there's a movement happening, an energy happening towards women all over the globe and towards women in business. And thanks to the people here, we are covering them more as athletes, and we'll cover them on their journey into business leaders. Thank you all so much. We're not done yet. Stay tuned for the next panel.
Thank you.